Hey everyone, how y'all doing? How'd you like the panel? That was really good. Like, I really liked when they got really deep into high fantasy versus urban fantasy. That's something that I had not really thought a lot about. It was really fun.
Man, that was a really fun panel. I like when they started talking about Bleach and Naruto.
Yeah. Like, man, you can get really, you can learn a lot about someone when you start talking to them about Bleach.
It's a pretty revealing conversation.
Yeah, it is. It
I
is.
find that most people prefer the first arc
Yeah,
over everything that happens afterward.
yeah. It's like how deep do they go? Like it tells you something about them.
For good reason.
I only finished Bleach out of obligation. I was already in too deep.
Yeah, I've definitely heard some people do that, like where it's like an addiction at that point. We're like, well, gotta finish it. Well, let's get started then. So this is going to be a bit of an interview. If you've never heard of Folklore before, if you've never heard of either Adam or Colin, you're gonna get to learn about them and learn about the great comic that they make. So to help everyone who might not know you, can you two introduce yourselves?
Yes. I'm Adam Ma, the writer slash co-creator of Folklore.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Colin Tan. Yeah, and I illustrate folklore.
Well, and this is really interesting because like a lot of comics on Hive or on other like other comics that I see, typically they have like one creator or a creator and they hire a colorist or they work with teams in a different kind of way. And you two are very much like collaborators together when it comes to building folklore, but each of you have individual things that you bring into it that I really want to like dig into and start asking questions about because it's super interesting to me from the outside. When because both of you are working on this, I'm sure as you wander around, as you do things, people will ask you like, "Oh, what's folklore?" How do each of you pitch it to other people or like talk to other people about it?
So, we received a um I guess the review or an impression of folklore from someone. I forget their name. I'm so sorry, but um this one really stuck with me, and it was The Incredibles meets The Walking Dead.
Oh, that's a good way to say it.
Which, yeah, so I mean, obviously, Adam and I have when we're at cons, we have a more in depth pitch, I guess, uh, to tell someone if they don't know what folklore is, to tell them what the premise is without any spoilers. But yeah, it's pretty much The Incredibles meets The Walking Dead.
That's a really good start. And Adam, what do you say?
Yeah, at a con, a lot of it is like casting out a line with like with like a specified lore. So like Incredibles meets The Walking Dead has always been like my favorite tagline that we've kind of received from reviews. I usually just start by saying it's a superhuman horror story. And I know like the ideal elevator pitch is like a sentence or two that really gets you into it, but it doesn't usually take us very long to like start going really in depth into the plot anytime we're talking with someone about like what the background of folklore is and what our lore is and how it works. It's at its core, it's just superhuman horror, and that's like the groundwork, I guess, to ease someone into a very long-winded explanation that comes after.
Yeah, extremely long-winded.
Well, like that's one of the things that I really appreciated about reading through folklore was that you both of you worked very hard. I could see both in the art and the writing to try to ground these characters and not in a way that is necessarily nihilistic or pessimistic, but when you're introduced to one of the main characters, Helios, you learn about, like, it's very much, you're trying to capture a feel about him that he is, I don't know if relatable is the right term, but very much a person. Like, you can see how he's, I mean, the very beginning of the story starts, like you say, with some horror elements, with like atmosphere building. And when you meet Helios, that is such an interesting thing. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you've managed to build an atmosphere where you can have superhumans in it, but you're still scared. There's still something to be worried about. Where if Superman shows up in a comic sometimes, you usually feel relief, or you feel like tension is gone. Is that something that you had to really like work on, or like really worry about when you started this story?
Yeah, definitely was. I mean, the idea was always that when a superhero shows up, you're usually like, oh, the day is saved, or you get ready for like like a DC slash Marvel, like a showdown. Like a
Yeah.
superhero shows up, they're there to meet a villain, and then they're there to like duel or duke it out. But here, the superhero shows up, and you know that they're not really a hero anymore. Or even if they were a villain, they're not really the same kind of villain that they were. And when I first started working on Folklore, the original idea, like the very, very first like few sentence pitches to Colin, was actually about the plot that's going on right now with Quietus. Quietus, this whole arc, issues 4, 5, and 6, was originally the start of Folklore, and we realized partway through writing what was then issue 1, now issue 4, that we needed to explain more, that like there wasn't enough about the world or the characters. So we paused, and then we created what is now issues 1, 2, and 3 to help kind of ease into the world and the characters and why things have gone the way they are.
Yeah. And like the building that world, I can see that both of you worked hard to, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit later, but the ways in which you have let people have multiple access points into this story to learn bits in different formats that I think work really well for what you do is really fascinating. I'm going to turn on a slideshow for everyone so that everyone can start seeing some pages and some images from Folklore. And we may comment on them as they flip through. We may not, but this is so that everyone can sort of get an understanding of when we talk about superhuman horror, which there is some history of from my vague memories, but it's not something that people say. It's not like it's not a common category at a library or a bookstore, but it's really interesting. It's a really, really fun thing. Can you tell me, both of you, Adam and Colin, what inspired you to tell this story together?
So Adam approached me. Beforehand, we had been working together as an editorial team on a gaming website.
Oh, interesting.
And so Adam approached me with his comic pitch for Folklore, and what we were talking about building that atmosphere, about having that feeling of when a superhero shows up, and not having that sense of relief, but rather a sense of fear and uncertainty. That was sort of the reason why I jumped on board, because his writing just built that world up, and I could see it clearly.
That's awesome. Adam, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you, and what's like, how long was this idea sitting in you before you started talking with Colin about it?
I actually started, I mean, it's a long time now, but I didn't actually think too much about making a horror comic until shortly after the original release of the Marvel Zombies run.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of a cool idea. Like it was playing into like zombie fever was like at its highest. Like Walking Dead was out,
Yeah.
the show was doing okay. Like everyone was trying to get like some part of the zombie action. There was like a million zombie games that were coming out. And so Marvel did their Marvel Zombies run, which the TLDR behind that is that superheroes turn into zombies and then they start murdering each other and spreading the zombie plague. Um,
Hmm.
and I thought like that's it's a cool idea, but like I wish it was scary.
Yeah.
And like I wish like there was a reason to be like more afraid of like Spider-Man than just the fact that he's a zombie. Like it, that seems like a really easy route. Like he is a zombie, so he's scary. And so I started thinking about ways that like superheroes would or could be scarier than just like obviously imposing or just obviously we're told to be afraid of them because they've got a skull instead of a face. And that kind of is what Folklore was spun from. It was just kind of a little disappointment from that specific comic release.
Yeah, and I mean, even I didn't read the whole run, but even from the beginning, it very much was positioned like a standard what if story from Marvel, where
Yeah.
there's a little bit of like tongue in cheekness, there's a little bit of like comedy, sort of Deadpool angle of like, isn't this an interesting idea? Isn't this a little strange? But and I remember some panels from it being pretty like intense for some people, but overall the tone was like, wouldn't it be weird if Hulk was a zombie?
Yeah.
Versus trying to ground that in how terrified you'd be if you saw someone that you'd respected turn into something like that. And without spoiling, I do think, speaking of what I just said, in the very beginning of Folklore, there is a character that feels a bit like there's some sympathy to that character. And I think you might know who I'm talking about. Like, it's not Helios. And you provide some sort of grounding of like this character, this hero that you've seen being twisted in some way. You have sympathy for them at the same time, but you're terrified of them. And I think that's right away. You two do such a great job of that. In the chat, I am going to post, if you type !folklore, you'll see links for everyone, the comic, and the @ are for everyone's Twitter handles. I will also repeat this at the end. So you can see both Adam and Colin. And speaking of both of you, when you work on this together, like when you build an arc, when you build a page, how do you two start? Like, how do you two start the process?
It usually starts from Adam's script. What we usually do is we do a script breakdown before we start on any page, and we just read through it together.
And what does that script look like? Is it just like an outline, or is it like a movie script or a teleplay script where you have individual like dialogue bits?
It's a little more it's kind of more teleplay with a little cinematic description in there. There's dialogue bits and facing blocking for every single character. So I usually set the perspective, and then I'll say who each character is talking to, even if that other character is off panel or if they're not seen at all. So if it's like a dead on shot of Helios talking, I'll still say who he's talking to, which I think helps ground the scene a little bit more, so that like his eyes are always going to be going into a very specific direction based on where the positions of the characters were in the last panel. And then we break it down panel by panel. So sometimes I'll make a page that is rarely I will make a page that is spot on, where it's like 4 panels, perfect, done. A lot of the times we'll read it and we'll decide, oh, okay, maybe this needs to be 3 panels. Maybe the action here could actually be 6 panels, and we just cut it up into smaller bits of movement. But usually we'll go page by page, and there will always be some sort of adjustment that needs to be made for the clarity of the reader.
Interesting.
And,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
going on from that after, like the editing and the adjustments don't just end at the script. Because after that, I'll start doing thumbnails for all the pages, layouts, and more often than not, I'll find that okay, maybe the adjustments that we had made in the script read through aren't quite working, and then we'll make adjustments accordingly at the thumbnail layout stage.
And then as you are doing that, like as you make those adjustments, do you does this process, does it feel like you've started, because you've been working on this for a bit, does it feel like you two have like a good rhythm set?
Yeah, I definitely say so. Like we're at a point now where it used to take us like around a year to make one issue, just figuring out like what things should look like, or even like the tone of the world. Like it takes a lot to figure out like what the world of folklore looks like in terms of like a visual dictionary or Bible. And having a lot of that groundwork now done, we can say like, okay, what does this individual character need to look like, or what does this action scene need to look like? And it's a different type of work, but it's not nearly as strenuous as it used to be.
Good. And like, so at the very beginning, you had to do a ton of concept work to sort of build a consistent visual language, right?
Yeah, I had been doing a bunch of concept art just to figure out like, we had different eras that we settled on. Like we had the golden age of heroes where, peace was great, and what does that look like? And we had figured as a nice contrast between our current timeline and the past, that the past would be much more saturated with color. It just feels a bit more hopeful. And now, not to say that we desaturated the look, because I don't think it's that desaturated. But the color palette is definitely a lot more darker.
Yeah, like when I see the images, I mean, just from my memory of reading through the pages, when you talk about the Age of Heroes before the story begins, there are purples in both, but the purples in like the image you see now, the values are a lot, like you said, darker. And I don't think, yeah, I agree with you that I don't think saturated. It doesn't feel muddy. But it does feel harsher. Like it feels like, you see a lot of scenes like this scene right here where there's still daylight. But it feels like empty, like the city that they're in exploring in this part feels like hollow, like it's been bored out. And here in this interior scene, you see you still have a lot of light sources coming in, but you see like green on their faces. You've done a lot to keep this from feeling too, like the tone that you're going for is not like a gothic horror. So you're not giving them sort of like Hellboy shadows. And
yeah, as much as I would love to give them Hellboy shadows, because on a production level, that would be so much. Not say easier, but definitely, because even just figuring that out is a whole other story.
Well, yeah, like it is interesting because I love hearing about concept work and trying to figure out what is the right tone that we're going for. Like as a designer at Hive and other places, like I like helping to build a particular visual language. So when I designed your site, I was trying to make sure that I was not contradicting the like tech language that you have, the way that technology works in this future that you have. Because you've said it, is this on Earth or like an alternate Earth?
It's on Earth, but the timeline is slightly adjusted.
Okay. So like they had Die Hard the movie, but it's like slightly in the future.
Probably.
Okay.
We actually talk about this a lot, like in terms of having pop culture references and like serials and stuff. Like I think we're always going to lean away from like saying that like a band or an artist or something like that exists, but there may be times where like someone will make a reference to like a brand as a company or something like that.
Yeah, like I've already detected from what I've read that there is some corporate like structures that existed before everything went to crap. Um, but there's not, and not that there's a ton of time for people to just like, meander and talk, because there's a lot of stuff that happens, which I want to talk about that later too. But no one's like, hey, what was your favorite band? Like those kind of conversations don't really come up. And I think that gives it a sort of, I don't know if timeless is the right word, but I think it removes it from discussions of like Garfield or something, like.
Well, it's like there's actually an element of fantasy. This is what kind of makes folklore hard to pin down as a genre in terms of like us pitching it as well, because there is a common trope that happens in post-apocalyptic media where at some point the survivors sit down and they talk about the things that they missed, and it's always like, oh, I love this brand, or I like this type of food, or this restaurant, or this play or musical or something like that, and they can bond over that. But because we're trying to create like a unique world lore, we lose a lot of those little character moments, or the potential for those little character moments, if we don't work really hard to establish like a firm lore in the background. So I think I think we might have referenced Benadryl. But like in talking about something that the reader already knows about, you can connect with them so much easier than having to re-explain a brand new type of allergy medication that they can then correlate with like a real world problem. So like we always have to be very careful in terms of what it is that the reader can empathize with in terms of comforts. And that's something that fantasy books like and movies do really well. Like people can understand what it is to be around a fire together, or to have warmth, or to be in a hearth. Like they may have never had mead before, but they understand like, oh, that's a comforting thing. We have to find modern day ways of relaying that sort of comfort without having to lean on the fact that like partway through a shot they drink a can of Coca-Cola in an abandoned warehouse.
Yeah, and like I think that some properties like I Am Legend and other sorts of post-apocalyptic stuff, they can lean really hard into the ephemera. Like even Wally sort of made their own brands to do this. The thought of walking around discarded, Coke cans and things like that. And the flavor that you two have brought to folklore is like you have a lot of characters who and I don't mean this as a pejorative, but like they're archetypal, and I think that has the strength of like, you have a journalist who is understandably very mad about a lot of things, and you can ping them off of characters like Helios, who is the one with the beard that you see in these images. And I think that has a strength there. But the way they relate is more like on a fundamental level, or more like what you're talking about with hearths and mead, a like person to person level. And I think that gives this, rather than a bunch of people, like we were saying, like rather than a bunch of people comparing what their favorite bands were before the end of the world, there's a lot of like very meaningful connections that happen very quickly in this comic. Is that on purpose?
Yeah, when I think about this kind of relates to like the corporate discussion earlier. When I think about people connecting to one another, I think about I haven't read the book because I don't want to depress myself, but the movie The Road.
Oh wow.
There's
Yeah.
that sequence with yeah, the dad and the son, and they're constantly finding like corporate things from the past, and every time they find it, it's a relief. Like finding cereal with weird names, or like candy that used to exist. Like the boy finds this stuff and constantly just wants to relive it, and it's always a place of comfort for the dad. But there's that scene where they sit and they drink a soda together, and it's like the Coke can that they're holding is like venerated, like it's this holy relic from this bygone era. And it's cool, but I want that without the logo. I don't want to show that anymore. Like I don't think we need to obsess over that, because the whole point is that like part of that is the broken system that Helios was a part of. So we don't need to worship that anymore. We just need to focus on the characters, and that's where these character archetypes come in, where like they're very much like, oh, I see. There's the journalist, the soldier, the kid, the grizzled veteran. They have things to interact with each other that don't involve products.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the strengths of having archetypal characters, in my opinion, is that you can dive beyond the like surface layer of things, and try to hit something that is like, I feel very much that folklore is a kind of story that you could translate to a lot of other languages, and probably there's like bits that would not make sense. There's bits that you'd have to smooth over because translators do a hard ass job. And but I do think that there's something that can be approached from many different angles from this, and I feel like folklore is a story that you could come back to years from now and still find something in, which doesn't mean other kinds of stories are weaker, but that is definitely a strength that I've caught from folklore. When it comes to the kinds of characters, the kinds of like, since we're using the term archetypes, do you, Adam, as the writer, did you very intentionally set up what kind of archetypes, like what kind of characters come in first?
Yes. So a lot of the chapters that we work on, we have intentionally focused on one character or another to get a little bit more spotlight in terms of like character development. And one of the first things that was really important to me, which we hear this a lot, is Diana and Helios. Everyone hates Diana. She's a huge bitch.
Who is Diana right. again?
Diana is the journalist.
Okay.
She's you actually see her in the slideshow running away from a shadow monster. She's a journalist. She previously was one of the few journalists who wasn't necessarily against the former government, but was extremely critical of the shape that the former government was taking. And she is unapologetically angry, like furious over the fact that all this time she was essentially right. She was seen as a conspiracy theorist. She was seen as a troublemaker and a huge pain in the ass. But she was in the end right. And making it clear that she was maybe not the most polite or nicest person, but that she does have a good heart. She's just sort of kind of insufferable about it, was really important, because her relationship with Helios is always going to be the other side of the conversation. It's very easy to just look at heroes and then constantly see the heroic things that they do and just treat them as being incredible. But Diana is there as the other side of the coin, who says you're not always right. You historically speaking, destroyed our world. So maybe let's take another look at things.
Well, I think that's really fascinating, because like you say, it is so easy to see, especially in this story, Helios as a source of comfort, as a protagonist that you want to rally around, and to try to poke a hole in that, to try to say like Helios was a part of the problem that came up with this. To anyone who doesn't understand what we're talking about, the setup of this story is, Adam, do you want to do this, or would you like me to?
You know what? I would be interested to hear your perspective to see if we did a
Okay.
good job.
So, and you get this very quickly when you read the story. I believe it happens within the first 3 pages. Like, Adam and Colin do a really good job of being like, bam, bam, bam. Here's what you need to know. Now let's go. And so in the beginning, heroes started to appear slowly over time. I believe actually, wait, no, it was an event that caused them, right? Like, and these heroes start congregating, and then as more of them appear, supervillains also started to appear. Then they started to form factions. When these factions started to war, things got way out of hand and way more chaotic. People eventually had to like flee city centers because of how bad this was getting. They eventually develop a technology that allows them to stop these powers, like turn off people's powers. But the unfortunate side effect is that a lot of times it kills them and it makes their powers go haywire. They put it into a bomb called the Ark, and when it blows up in the atmosphere, which they call the dusting, when this dusting happens across the planet, some superheroes' powers go completely chaotic. Some of them just die straight up. And it ruins the planet in a way. And now these survivors, who Diana, who you see in the blue vest right here, is one of, are trying to survive. And instead of there being zombies or whatever other kind of post-apocalyptic setup you have some people whose powers have gone haywire. You have people whose superpowers have just turned off, all over the place. And so you have to survive in this world as a person, and you don't know what's going on. Like, you don't know who you meet could have been one of these superhuman people. They might have a secret power you don't know. They might be completely out of control. And the story starts with a team of people coming to a location where a bunch of superheroes, I believe Helios was in charge of them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they created a place called, it was Bastion, right? I'm pretty sure about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. They make a place called the Bastion, which is for human survivors to just be. But when they get there, this little group finds out that it's completely ruined. And they have to get the hell out. And that's when they meet Helios, and that's when the story begins. Is that a good summary? Did I miss anything?
That's pretty much it.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Whew. But like, speaking of all this stuff, speaking of archetypes and things like that, one of the things that I think does a really good job, because both of you do a lot of work to not overload the reader in the beginning. Like, I didn't feel like I was having to insert words into my brain with a needle. But Colin, you also do a lot of work to get across like a ton of information in those first 3 pages. And the way in which you do Helios, the way in which you've made these characters, you've made them archetypes. We talked about that. You do a really good job of making Helios seem heroic, but also like a person. Is there anything that you had to do? Were there versions of Helios where he was more superhuman, superhero, Superman, and then you had to tone him down?
There was definitely at some point a version of Helios that was very Superman-like. I mean, he is the Superman archetype.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right. We wanted to show that he, as a hero, he does do heroic things, but those heroic things also have consequences on the world, and not necessarily positive consequences. And I figured, I mean, it took a bit of iteration, but I took a lot of inspiration from other properties that I felt did the job really well in portraying the hero as a very human character.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of those properties, Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
Yeah. So Solid Snake, Big Boss, they're both the heroes of that game. Although Big Boss later becomes the the villain, but that's a whole other story.
Mm-hmm.
And what I felt that as characters, they were very well developed. They had their motivations. They had their not only their heroic moments, but also their failures. And the failure part, was what I grabbed onto in trying to portray Helios as not only a hero of the Golden Age, but also the catalyst that caused the fall of it.
Yeah. And like I think Metal Gear Solid is an interesting touch point because I can see in that series, the team that worked on that trying their hardest to not only elevate these characters to heroes, to people that everyone talks about, but also they tried really hard to pop that bubble once in a while to show how silly they were, how like humorous they could be, but also how wrong they could be about something. And I think that when you have a main character, it can be really hard to do that, where you spend so much time with them, you build empathy with them, you see their reasoning for why they're making decisions, and you have to work really hard to show the audience that they are not infallible. When it came to the other aspects of these designs, Colin, did you is there anything that you've learned about how you show this post-apocalyptic world? Is there anything that you didn't know when you first started?
Starting out, I didn't know a lot of things because this was my first graphic novel.
Whoa, you're doing a really good job.
Thank you. So I had done some web comics before, but they were just sort of one-offs. But this was my first real like constructed narrative to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a testament of Adam's writing and how good and how clear and concise it can be. That when it comes to the visuals, it's not terribly difficult for me to put pen to paper or stylus to tablet, just because I can see it so clearly. And speaking of our inspirations, like I mentioned Metal Gear Solid, but I've had other inspirations that I've tried to channel into this world, and that's the thing. The world is a character in and of itself.
Yeah.
It shows us who these characters are, because they're not necessarily always just facing a villain. Oftentimes it's the world that they're in, that it's bleak, it's hostile. There are portions that are safe, and then portions that aren't.
I really like that about what the style you've picked and how you portray this. Is sometimes when I get into post-apocalyptic fiction, in an effort to try to make things seem threatening in order to show the degradation of society and breakdown, it can just feel hopeless. So it'll feel like you get to a point where you're like, well, they're screwed. Okay, I'm done reading the story now. And here, I think that you have this interesting contrast where when they're in the Bastion and trying to get out, when, like in this scene, there is someone talking in the chat right now about fleeing the Quietus, which is a character that we'll talk about in a bit that is currently in the story. That's very threatening. And I know the gravity of the situation. I can feel the weight. But when they're just walking around and there's like nothing going on and they just have to travel somewhere, you do these really great perspective shots that open up, but don't feel like they're going to die in the next second or something. Like you give us the chance as the reader, you give us the chances to breathe. And I really appreciate the work from both of you. Because it sounds like, Adam, you have some influence on the pacing in that way. But you both have built something where it's not just slamming me with cynicism and that everyone's going to die. But I still feel that threat. Adam, when you are, was that an intentional thing that you wanted to have a variety in the tone, or did it sort of come naturally? Was it a decision you made early?
Yeah, I think, especially for post-apocalyptic stories, the general trope for that genre is that everything sucks and everything's just really bad, and then maybe in the 11th hour something can turn good, and maybe like that something good is small. Like in the case of The Road, it's finding more people to be with, um, or it could be that life will go on, or the planet will find a way. That wasn't the goal here. Like I didn't want anyone to be sad 24/7 while going through this, because this is more of it's a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's a story that's more about redemption and coming to terms with the choices you've made, and growing from them. And every single person in this cast has something that they need to grow from and learn from, and that's more important to me than hammering you with just gore and violence like 24/7. Even the villains, even the monsters themselves are reflections of anxieties, or unfulfilled wants or dreams that they can very easily consume us. And we see that in it's a little harder to see, I think, for the time being, in Quietus. But that's something that you see very clearly in Titan, who is the previous
Yes.
antagonist for a brief period.
Yeah. And it's that, gosh, Titan is a character that, as soon as I saw Titan and I learned, I had an idea of what might have been going on with them as soon as I saw them, but it was confirmed later. The way in which both of you handled that, I really want to commend you for, because there is a version of this in another reality where you could have really hammered home on the melancholy of that, of the tragedy of that, but you gave it this space where I could stop and think about how horrifying that is, or how, as a person who likes to protect the people I care about, how that can be mutated in some way, or warped. And you're right. Like, these characters, that's one thing that I really like about this, where I'm a big fan of tabletop role-playing games, and often the games think that your character dying is the consequence, rather than losing the arc of the story of their journey that they're on. And for me, I'm terrified of Helios dying, not because I'm terrified of gore. I want to see where he grows. I want him to change, and I want Diana to be nicer to some people once in a while. But like, if Diana were to eat it in this last chapter, I would feel very sad. For many reasons, but one of them is that her arc gets cut short. She dies before she's made any growth, and you giving us that opportunity in this is awesome. Like, when you talk about this, everyone having an arc, everyone learning from something, you're talking about these characters, especially Titan, now that you mention them, is sort of like metaphoric. Colin, does this factor into how you portray them and how you design them?
Totally, yeah. So for example, for Titan, Adam had given me a brief of what he was like in the Golden Age, and you see him for a brief period in the first couple of pages, and Helios even talks about him, and just describing his personality. Like, even though his power was basically super strength, but he was gentle and compassionate.
Yeah.
And what happens when that gets twisted? When that sentiment of having this goal to protect the people and the things that you care about gets dialed up to the extreme, and what does that look like?
Yeah. Like, I noticed right away when you see them at first, they have a face that is capable of being kind. Like, there is a softness to that character where there are some designs that I've seen where there's no way they can smile based on the way they're drawn. Or if they did try to smile, it'd look creepy. And I could see very deliberately that you had made Titan to be someone who could be friendly, who, and there was more fear on their face than fury. And that freaked me out, like seeing that happening. And I see that in some of the other designs that you've done for these characters. Was that something like, did you have to go through some iterations with Adam to be like, is this right? Or does it come naturally to you?
I definitely confer with Adam. Like, I'll do a few sketches, send it his way, would talk about it. Quietus, for example, took a little bit of iteration to get right. Just so one of the things that we did, and I was talking to Adam about this when we were working on this current issues 4, 5, and 6, was that whenever Quietus shows up, or whenever our group is in danger and in very close proximity to Quietus, I wanted to shift the color palette towards a sickly green.
Ooh.
Right. So you're not necessarily seeing Quietus as a whole figure, whether he's on panel or not. But once it starts shifting green, then you know he's coming.
Oh, interesting.
So
I hadn't noticed that.
That was part of his character design, and it's not something that's obvious on his outward appearance, because he's just like a creepy shadow creature puppet kind of thing. And but here, for example, this page, when they're in the house, compared to the previous page when they're outdoors, with blue sky, things look fairly normal. I mean, the town looks abandoned, and suddenly Quietus shows up. And
I was gonna say there are a ton of color hints that Colin, just without even me really saying anything, employs all over the comic. This one's a great example because light is something that Quietus doesn't like. So seeing the little bit of light at the very end of that last panel, you know that they're at least running to safety. But a huge defining factor for Helios's design, which is something that I did not suggest, was changing Helios's speech bubble to be that golden yellow that's the same as his eyes.
Yeah. That is really effective.
Yeah, it helps immediately distinguish him as someone who was important, who was like either a leader or special. Like even when he is sad or melancholy, or when he looks like he's because there are plenty of panels where Helios does not look like he's very much in control, and he's just sort of stewing in his own sadness.
He's not always smiling.
Yeah, he's still, anything he says, you're sort of compelled to listen, and that's just because he was such a heroic figure. That history, that looking for the word, I guess the ideal of what he was. Yeah, the lineage, the history behind his actions, the weight of that is still there in his words, no matter what he's saying, and it's a blessing and a curse. But that subtle little addition was just purely like from Colin.
Yeah, and I think like you can see it right here when he says "kill it." Like, I think that's very interesting because it does draw my eye. It's different than everything else, and using that as a tool to distinguish this character from all the other people, that is very fascinating. I had not thought, because I noticed it and I thought it was cool, but I had not thought about the impact of it on me as a reader, like in the experience of me as a reader. That's really fascinating. Whose idea was that? Colin, that was your idea, right?
That was, yeah.
That's really cool. Good job, Colin.
Thank you.
You did it.
Yeah.
Woohoo.
We are not necessarily at the end of the time, but we're slowly going to land the plane. But before we do, I want to talk about all this other cool stuff that you guys have been doing on Folklore. Like, Adam, you've been writing short stories. Can you talk a little bit about like what compelled you to start that way, to start doing them? Like what has the process been like?
Yeah. So there's a lot of lore to the world, and a lot that we together want. Like, there's only so many hours in the day that Colin can illustrate and bring folklore to life on a visual level. But there's a lot that we want to discuss and a lot that we want to share and talk about. And sometimes it's just a cool monster that we want to like invent, or like this guy here, this crow nightmare man. Sometimes it's just an interesting story or perspective. Folklore is I don't want to say that we're all about representation in a way that like every single issue is going to have some new diverse face, but like diversity and representation is really important to us. And there's just avenues that the comic will not go to because the story isn't going. We're never going to drive the story just for the sake of representation. So there are just some peoples and cultures and backgrounds that won't have an appearance in folklore, but we still want to have those conversations. And that's where the short stories kind of come in. It also gives me a time to talk about the world and showcase the world, and gives Colin a little bit more time to work on the comic when we want to update something for our readers and still give them something to enjoy while they're waiting for new issues to come out.
It also gives me a lot of information to work on. Like even though like these short stories don't directly fit into the main comic, that's still information that I can use.
Yeah. And like one thing I haven't been able to mention yet is Folklore has a wonderful pace where it doesn't feel like you're getting bored and going like, there needs to be a fight here, we're getting bored. Like, it doesn't feel artificial. But when action happens, like in this scene here, this comes so quickly and it doesn't feel random, but it does feel like intense. So encounters don't last long in Folklore from what I've seen so far. They are very hectic. And Colin, you do a really good job of conveying a ton of information during these scenes. Both of you, I know both of you worked collaboratively on this. But then like I was saying before, there are moments of breath. There are moments afterwards to like chill out after, they have to run from something. And I think that you doing these short stories, Adam, now correct me if I'm wrong, feels like a way for you to get out a lot of information and to talk about a lot of fun things, but keep the pacing the way that you have in Folklore, like the pages that Colin is building. Is that right?
Yeah, that's basically it. Like we can, with the short stories, we can say like, okay, let's have a short story about the Federation and talk about what that was or what that was like. That's not something that we can immediately do in the comic, but via the short stories, if someone's interested in learning more about, what life was like on a reservation during the Golden Age, or what life was like being a Federation officer, or being a regular person, or living in an apartment complex or a city or community. Those are all the things, like what happened to zoos in the apocalypse. These are all sort of questions that we can answer and still maintain the flow of information that we have in the comic. It's just nothing but like bonus data for you to soak in.
Yeah. And there's been plenty of like manga, comics, media where I have been getting really into the story that I'm in. And then the author goes, oh crap, I need to like explain how like ships work or what's going on. And one of my friends at one point pointed out a series that they've been liking where they started to figure out that as soon as you got a flashback about a character, that meant that they were going to die. Because they needed to get out some emotional information about the character. And here you are doing a really good job of not giving me any hints on what, like who's about to die or like what's about to happen. Colin, you have the color hints of like, oh, there's something dangerous happening, but it's not like you're pointing an arrow at a person where it's like, oh, suddenly we learned about their tragic backstory. They're going to die now.
Right. No, it's more of a vague,
it's like a tone.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
And I really like that. I really like how for people who are interested in finding out a lot more of this structure, which, Adam, you've done such a good job of building a solid structure for everything to hinge on, the way that the superheroes are acting, the way that, you know, the foundation worked and how it fell apart. People can dig into that and see something from one individual's perspective, where here the comic seems to be a bit more of like a third person thing, where we don't get any insight into people's thoughts in the comic, which I really like. Colin, last that we were talking, we were talking about like trading cards that you both have been working on.
Yeah, so the trading cards, this is something that we had been wanting to do for our patrons, just as an extra bonus, but also just something fun to do on the side. We don't know yet if we want to make an actual trading card game, but we do know that we want to make trading cards or collectible cards, because we think it would be fun, and it's also a fun way to just showcase more of the characters and more of the world of folklore.
Yeah, that's interesting because, like, man, I've never thought about. I know I'm not saying that you should make them in universe, but the thought of someone coming across a Helios trading card in this setting, like right now, in where the story is, would be weirdly poetic. You know,
I
like,
could definitely say they exist.
That's wild. That's really cool. Like, I like the idea of, you know, like bottle caps and stuff in Fallout being anachronistic and kind of like parody when you see them when everything is so screwed up. I love the idea of someone just like stepping on a Helios trading card, picking it off their boot and going, oh yeah, I remember this stuff.
I mean, technically, I think it's in issue 4. Greg comes across a poster for the Federation, and there's little hints as well, like, because that's the Federation is what Helios technically built up. So you'll definitely see like little bits of the past that are still there that are kind of golden era, like posters and, you know, comics or video games or cereal brands, stuff like that, where, you know, it used to be a brand, it used to be a company. So you'll definitely have a chance to see like that kind of stuff pop up every now and then.
That's really cool. Are you going to release the trading cards at some point? Like what is the plan? Are these like fun things to post online?
The plan right now is still in super early. Like, I'm just doing sketches for them right now. But yeah,
Cool.
The plan is to release them, give them out to our patrons especially, and to have some sort of physical, tangible thing to give out at conventions as well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Can either of you post your Patreon in the chat so that people can know where it is?
Yeah, sure.
So as we wind down, I would like to ask you both, what's next for Folklore? Like, what right now in the current chapter, you see some of these. Ooh, I did not. I apologize.
That's all good.
No, I thought that I had added you. My apologies. I will.
I'll send you. the link.
I got it.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No.
Here we go.
We're not bots, I swear.
Apologies. We set it up so that the URLs got caught, but my bad. I must have set something wrong. So this is their Patreon, and this is where you can get some of those trading cards once Colin and Adam get done with them. So what is next for Folklore right now? The chapter, we're at chapter 6, right? Which is you're calling them issues, like issue 6.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah. So we're at issue 6, and the crew do you have a name for the crew right now, like internally?
I think I just call them the gang,
Okay.
which is
Yeah,
very
we
always
usually
sunny.
refer to them as the gang.
So the gang have encountered Quietus, and they are trying to get the heck away. Can you reveal anything about what's coming up next?
So, their big mission. We have Folklore kind of broken down into major and minor story arcs, and their major story arc is to eventually get to the lair of Dr. Necrosis, I believe, which is a very 80s, super 80s.
I love that name. I really like that name.
Yeah, very very theatrical man Dr. Necrosis was.
Very dramatic.
Yeah.
So their goal is to get to his lair and acquire weaponry that they can use to fight back against some of these abominations that have shown up. And that's part of the reason that fights are very, very fast and very brutal in Folklore, is because they're all very one-sided.
They're very
yeah.
ill-equipped to handle the crisis at hand.
So as far as the immediate plot line, we can say that that's where they're headed, and they'll have a few stops along the way before they get there. But I don't want to give away too much more.
Obviously. And then, Colin, do you have anything that you want to talk about coming up, or the trading cards? Good.
I'm currently working on the trading cards. As far as the what's coming up next for the main comic, I can say that I've started on issue 7.
Ooh.
We've done our script breakdown, our panel breakdowns, and I'll be working on thumbnails and layouts next. So hopefully I can get it done in time.
Awesome. Well, as I said before, I am going to repost it in chat that you can read their comic at folklorecomic.com. You can follow Adam at 34th Gingerbread on Twitter, and Colin at unartifacts. You can see the spellings in the chat. And thank you both. Thank you both for doing this. This is like our first interview thing that we've done. And it's been really fun talking to you again.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, this has been awesome.
Awesome. So, for everyone, we are going to be doing, we're going to be continuing this tomorrow. We're going to have a panel where we have, where we bring on Taylor Robin from Never Satisfied, and some other, and Atla, the editor, from Hiveworks. We're going to have them talking about comics and like recommendations. So they'll talk about the comics that they like currently, and things that they're enjoying. And then after that, I am going to be having an interview with Brienne from HarpyG. And I'm pretty excited about that. I hope to see you all there. Thank you all for spending this time with me. Again, thank you to Adam and Colin. And I am going to be signing off right now. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Stay safe.